today we're going to be mostly going over stuff that you already know, and then kind of just discussing it today. And then we're going to hit the World War I stuff, which you guys don't know anything about. So we're going to be talking today by starting about imperialism. Okay? Now, hopefully, in your AP World class, AP Euro class, or regular World Civ class, you have already learned about some of this stuff. So a lot of this might just be a little bit of a refresher. So thinking, for example, over in Africa, which is probably one of my favorite examples of imperialism, because it's crazy how much people imperialized Africa. So on the left, this is in 1890. Okay, so this is what Africa looks like in 1890. Those are the 4 countries that own some parts of Africa. This picture is 20 years later. Okay, now if you notice, what this is showing you is that almost no parts of Africa, except Ethiopia and basically South Africa, were actually their own independent nations. Instead, they were owned by so many different places. So when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about this takeover of all these different nations. Now, imperialism has a lot of different consequences and effects and different things like that when we talk about moving into these other countries. So, for example, okay, a couple years ago, I went to Germany on like a little teacher trip. And this bank called the Deutsche Bank is the biggest bank in all of Germany. And they sponsored us to help go. So like half of the money is paid by taxpayers in Germany, half of the money is paid by the Deutsche Bank. And so one of our things that we did is we had to go to the Deutsche Bank into this place, and it's known as, it's actually called the Twin Towers. So it's the Deutsche Bank Twin Towers is the name of it. And basically, we went in there, and it was like this cute little meeting where they like tell us all the great stuff, and we'd be really nice to Deutsche Bank because like they want the money, right? But the Deutsche Bank meeting actually made me dislike the Deutsche Bank quite a bit, because in this meeting, we sat there for like 2 hours, and they were telling us how amazing that they were about basically everything that they did. And one of the things that they emphasized is that the Deutsche Bank pays a bunch of different organizations to be able to sponsor people. And one of their biggest ones was in Africa. And they basically send a ton of money to like African kids and women to become entrepreneurs. Well, as I was sitting in the Deutsche Bank, and if you remember, like you see all those big windows, we were in this giant room with all these windows. I looked behind me during one of the breaks, and I saw this really interesting restaurant sitting right at the bottom of the Deutsche Bank. And this restaurant is basically called the Ivory Colonial. And I was like, that looks like a really interesting, weird restaurant. It has like this African theme going to it. And so I was talking with our leader. I was like, what the heck is this like restaurant? And he's like, oh, so that restaurant is themed of the colonial period in Germany. So how it works is it's this very fancy colonial thing. Well, it's called the Ivory Club, and it's called Contemporary Colonial Cuisine. So what it has is, for each of the different areas in Africa that Germany took over, it has a menu section for that. So, for example, Algeria, Libya, whatever it could be that was controlled by the Germans. And the best part is, all the waiters are African, as in from African descent. And this is one of the fanciest clubs in all of Germany. It's very, very regal. Like the cheapest thing on the menu is $200 a pop. And you can go to this place and and I like this, like teach us delight in simple things. And it's all about like the colonialism, and it's very, And the interesting, see, this is, I was like, oh my gosh, can you imagine if this happened in America? Like if we had this, like, oh my gosh, that would be awful. But it was really weird because it was like glorifying this like colonialism that was going on with the Germans. And by the way, at the end of our presentation, we had time to go off and eat, and the lady at the Deutsche Bank said we should go there for dinner. And we decided not to. But I thought it was really interesting because they were sitting there telling us all the stuff that they were doing in Africa, but then you can go to this place that's sold out. It's very interesting how they'd be able to do that. But in Germany itself, it's really interesting too. They have a section of Germany, it's called the African Quarter, it's in Berlin, and all of the streets are named after a place that Germany took over. And then all the other streets, that because you're going to run out of names, are named after the commanders that overtook those African nations. and it's called the African Quarter. A big thing that they're trying to do right now, though, is they're actually trying to switch that, and they're replacing all the names with new names that are African leaders that resisted the colonial effort. So they are trying to reverse it a little bit, similar to how we have like Cesar Chavez Drive here in Utah, or we have like Martin Luther King Jr. Drive or something like that. That's what they're trying to do. But there's also something interesting as well with this imperialism, because obviously imperialism is still like common in Berlin, but people are also trying to kind of keep that. And so there's this flag, and it's called the German colonial flag. And this is the German colonies from 1870 to 1918 when they were at their height, and then once they were losing World War I, they lose all their colonies. But basically what happened is people fly this flag. It's very similar to how we would perceive the Confederate flag here in America, is people go and fly these flags, and one of the most common places that people fly the flag is in the African Quarter. So basically, also in Germany, the Nazi symbol is banned. So if you like draw it on your paper, it's actually against the law, and you can be charged with that. So you can't fly the Nazi flag, but you can fly this flag. And so a lot of people will use this as well as like a racial superiority thing in German too. So all of these are kind of examples, though, of that imperialism that you can still, in fact, see today. So when we talk about other types of imperialism as well, what about cultural imperialism? Okay, for example, McDonald's. Now, McDonald's, of course, that's the American way, right? It's like fast food. I don't remember if I showed this class or not. Maybe I need to add this into the PowerPoint. But when I was in Germany, we asked the kids in Germany to like list all the things they think about when they think of America, and like the third on there was fast food, right? Because most other countries don't have fast food. And so when we look at something like this with the McDonaldization of America, if you guys want to know a crazy statistic, 70% of Americans live within 1 mile of a McDonald's. And if you're like, oh, that's not me, well, I put my address in, and I had 6 within a mile. And that's how many McDonald's was in like Midvale when I used to live in Midvale. So basically, like that's the McDonaldization. Well, the problem is people are concerned that this is too much American with fast food going into the world. So for example, if you're a big gymnastics fan, which I like love gymnastics. Did we talk about this? Oh, because you were looking like you knew. Okay.
Yeah, we talked about them. They were...
The Romanians?
Yeah.
Okay, so we did talk about it. So as a quick reminder, we talked about how the Romanians basically used to be like the best of the best in the entire world, and then all of a sudden dropped off in like 2000, and now they can't even qualify for the Olympics. And the coaches blamed it on Americanization. These kids are too American. They're on their cell phones all the time. They're on the internet all the time. They're not 100% committed to gymnastics anymore. And the Romanians tend to blame Americanization of the world because of that. So one other example other than the McDonald's of the world is also Starbucks. Starbucks has massively increased all throughout the world of what you can be able to have and not have. Well, when I was in Germany, oh, by the way, before I get to Germany, this is an example. So this was when the first McDonald's was put into Afghanistan. A lot of people were saying we're Americanizing them when they had this. By the way, the anniversary of Iwo Jima was 2 days ago. And anyway, so a lot of people said that this was really, really wrong. So when we look at back in Germany, of people not wanting this imperialization of America into the world, a great example is actually an experience that I had when I was there. So there's an area of Berlin that's known as the Turkish Quarter, and fun fact, it's where a whole bunch of Turkish people live. Yeah, so that's where all the immigrants tend to come from Turkey. That's one of their major immigrant groups. It's kind of like for here in America, we have a lot of like Latinos come in. In Germany, there's a lot of Turkish that come in. That's like their major immigrant force. So in the Turkish Quarter, though, it's extremely like basic. As in, they don't like new stuff. They like to stay classic with the old stuff. So you actually go through the Turkish Quarter, and they have like all these random like farms in the middle of a city. So like imagine the middle of New York City, there's like random farms places, because that's what people do in this Turkish Quarter. Well, when I was there, the guy was talking about how before the day, like we had just fine in Germany, nobody hated us except for when we were at restaurants. So it was no big deal. And then we get to the Turkish Quarter, and before we showed up, she said, look, we have to have like a disclaimer about the Turkish Quarter. You need to not act American in the Turkish Quarter. So she's like, you can't talk loud. Try to not look like a tourist. Try to just look like you're going through with a group, and don't talk. Don't speak English, okay? And the reason why is because she said people in the Turkish Quarter, they hate tourists, but they especially hate American tourists. They don't like it because they don't like the Americanization that's happened in the world. So we were in this group, and I have this little picture because this is in the Turkish quarter, but obviously I would be over there. But this is what we looked like. So we totally looked like tourists, right? We totally failed what we were supposed to do. So we were there and whatever, and we were in this group, and we were sitting not in this location, but a little bit down the street. And one of the biggest things they said is when you're on a sidewalk and we stop to talk about the Turkish quarter, make sure we all bundle up in a group and get as close to the street as possible so that you can leave a way for people to get through. Well, we're sitting there in this group and we're learning stuff, and this guy comes into our group, and she ends up actually hitting this lady right here. And she comes in, he hits her with like his shoulder, and he's like, F you Americans, and he grabbed her, and he threw her onto the ground, and he punched her in the face. I'm not even kidding. It's like a real story. And then he like took off. And she was okay. Like, she was fine. She was a little like off. And it became a great lesson because basically what happened is that we asked her, we're like, why would he act that way? He's like, they do not like outsiders. They want everything to remain classic. They don't want different things to come in. And so a better example of this, though, happened when Starbucks opened. So people started to be concerned, are Starbucks, are these things, are we just making everybody else these new Americans? And what happened is they opened the very first Starbucks in the Turkish quarter. It was actually the very first Starbucks in all of Berlin. And they were really excited. There was like ribbon cuttings, and they were building things. And a couple weeks later, there was a fire. Like, okay, that's weird. Okay, whatever, put it out. It must be an accident. A couple weeks later, another fire breaks out. Like, okay, there's starting to be a pattern, so they put little security guards outside. All of a sudden, the entire thing gets set on fire, and it burns the place to the ground. Okay? And signs were left out that said, don't bring America into Berlin. And what happened is, Starbucks conceded. They moved it a couple blocks down, so it was no longer in the Turkish quarter. And now the Turkish quarter does not have, and there's no Starbucks, there's no American restaurants whatsoever in there because they don't like the imperialism of America in the Turkish quarter. Okay? So when we talk about this imperialism, it's not just taking over countries, it's emotional, taking over all these different things. Okay? Now, in terms of things that you've learned, so again, some of this we're going to go through really quickly, and some of this I'm going to talk about a little bit more. You should already know all this stuff. Okay? So when you learned about the opening of Japan to the West, by the way, if you want to put next to this HC, that's the best contextualization. It all depends on when your essay prompt starts. So if you get an imperialism essay that starts in 1860, most of them start in 1865, and I'll tell you why. The opening of Japan to the West is really helpful. Now, I met with Mr. Watts after last class period because somebody in the class, aka Henry, decided to bring up some topics in the class, and I wanted to see what he had to say. So I have an update for you on the Black Fleet. Okay? Yeah. So if you learned about the Black Fleet in AP World, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, then I'm assuming that it was learned about because I've had like 6 people talk to me about it since then. Okay? So if you learned about the Black Fleet, that is gunboat diplomacy, but the Black Fleet was actually the term that was used in Japan. So it wasn't until AP World started to use it more that it became more accepted in America. So America, the term is gunboat diplomacy, while over in Japan, it's the Black Fleet. So you can use it interchangeably, whichever one you prefer, but it's the same thing. Okay? By the way, I would star in this section, gunboat diplomacy. You can also use that as contextualization. It's all about having the biggest, baddest weapon, right? We basically brought our boats outside of Japan and said, you either give us your trade or we're going to bomb you, and it worked. They opened up the Japan to trade. Now, Alaska, if you want to put a little line above Alaska, this is typically where essay prompts start with imperialism. So Alaska is usually the first thing that you can mention when you get to the imperialism. And I want to focus slightly on Alaska, simply because I find it really interesting what happens with it. So as you guys know from it, Seward buys Alaska from who? From Russia. And really, a lot of people thought this was horrible because it was just this giant, like, wasteland where there was all these loggers. There was no real good to it. It was all very cold. But regardless, though, he buys it for the best sale in American history at $7.2 million at 2 cents an acre. That is better than when we bought the Louisiana Purchase. However, Louisiana Purchase everybody was stoked about, and how did everybody feel about Alaska? It's total. We just bought a giant block of ice, which is why you get those awesome, funny cartoons of, they called it Seward's Folly or Icebox, which I would star that term, because that's a really great outside evidence point that you can bring in. And basically, it was this whole thing about how much of a joke it was. You bought a giant ice block. Unfortunately for Seward, it actually ruins his political career. He dies impoverished, and all the textbooks at the time said he was a complete idiot until 1959, which is when we found timber, oil, and various golden minerals. And then all of a sudden we appreciated Seward. But Alaska's a really good example because what I want you to put next to Alaska, this is the first major manifest destiny outside the continental United States. So Alaska's the first time we really went beyond our original borders and start taking and buying more land through manifest destiny. By the way, if you want to put at the top of your paper, the best contextualization of all imperialism is manifest destiny. Movement west. So another great contextualization would be manifest destiny. Now, Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, Influence Upon Sea Flower, I want you to go ahead and star this term. This is actually double star it because it's actually one of the more prominent ones that you'll see as a sourcing. Basically, what you need to know from this is exactly what I've explained before. I think one of the bullets has it on there that's a general summary, but what you need to know about it, the book said that the reason Britain was so great is because it had the biggest military and the biggest navy. So what is America going to do to become great? Get the biggest, baddest military. And it works especially with the Navy. So I'm going to combat your Great Black Fleet with the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet is in our culture what we talk about when we talk about the biggest, baddest military. So basically what we did is to be able to show everybody how fantastic we were, we changed all of our ships and we painted them white. Now you might say, well, wait a second. Why would we paint our entire ships white? First off, what color is most ships? Anybody know most naval ships? They're like a gray, bluish color because why? That's the color of water. White is not the color of water. What does that make it do to the ships? It stands out. It was basically the most flamboyant way of us saying we're fantastic. So even though this was actually militarily, strategically horrible, we did it because it made us seem fantastic. So we made all these massive ships, we painted them all white, and we ended up becoming the third biggest fleet in the world in the span of about 10 years. So it was extremely successful. So Alfred Thayer Mahan, very important in terms of expanding our military and preparing us towards war. Now, Turner Thesis may end up coming up. You already know what this is, so I'm going to move this along. But again, westward is closed. If you want to put the Turner Thesis, though, is really why we move beyond our borders. So the reason why we go into other countries is now because the Turner Thesis says we have no more space in America and we move on. Social Darwinism, you should already know. Social Darwinism, if you want to do an arrow down from Social Darwinism down to Spanish American, that's your historical context for the Spanish American War. Most people will say Social Darwinism. Now, Spanish American War is its own key concept, so I'm going to focus on Social Darwinism, or not Social Darwinism, sorry. Spanish American War a little bit more than the others. If you will double star this term, it is a must know. It is its own key concept. It's usually on the AP exam with at least one essay or multiple choice question on the Spanish American War. So, as you know, America starts to invest a whole bunch of money into the sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands. Basically what happens is there's a whole bunch of unrest. The Cubans want to rebel against the Spanish. This guy is the general of the Spanish military, and he decides to punish the Cubans. What does he do to the Cubans? Puts them in the concentration camps. And these concentration camps, by the way, is an appropriate name because it was just as bad as what Hitler did. Basically, he puts them into these camps. He puts 300,000 rebels in. 1/3 of them die within a year. Okay? And it is massively awful. There are primary sources of how babies would die, and that would be their meal. So they wouldn't feed them any food, and they'd say, all right, go eat that. That's your meat for the day. There's sources about women who they would like slowly cut off their body parts over like an extended period of time as like sport. There's ones about how you were considered like a Cuban rebel spy and they would kill you. The youngest killed rebel spy in the camps was 6 years old for allegedly stealing secrets and sending it to the rebels. All these different things. And if you want to see the most impactful photo of that, this is some of the photos that were collected in terms of the malnutrition, things like that. They estimate about 1/10 of all the people who died just from starvation alone, not from the other things as well. And then this one is a mass grave that was found in Cuba following the war. So when we talk about the treatment and things like that, that's what we're talking about, is this massive amount of death and destruction happening in Cuba. So we see all this, And in America, they start to publish stuff about it. And we start to be encouraged to start to do things about it. Now, in terms of the people who make this famous, is a guy named William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Which one have you probably heard of more? Pulitzer, because of why? The Pulitzer Prize, exactly. And it is named after him. Another reason you might know this people is if you watch an incredibly great movie called NEWSIES. And it's all about this. And if you haven't seen it, it's on Disney+. I watched it 2 days ago just for you guys. So you can go watch it. But Pulitzer and Hearst were the major people who owned two things called the New York Times and then the New York World. Both of them were these really big newspapers. Now the problem is there social media in the 1800s? No, there's no social media. Is there a news app that you can go look at the news on? No, not in the 1800s, right? You had these newspapers that people had to read, but there was a problem. You have two competitors, and news is constantly changing. So if you've ever seen NEWSIES, you know how the process worked of how they would get news. They would have the first edition, that's why it's called first edition of the day. That's the first newspaper of the day. It gives you all the news. Then, newspaper kids, like the NEWSIES, that's what they were called, would buy those papers and then sell them. And they would do these extra, read all about it. That's what they would be doing to convince people to read their newspapers. A couple hours later, the news changes. They reprint it and do the same thing all over again. Thank you. Bailey, you've been selected. So basically what would happen is there would be maybe 6, 7 newspapers in a single day. So you would have to figure out how to put those out there and sell newspapers. So let's talk about these exaggerated headlines. Now, who has ever seen news magazines that look like this? Everybody, right? What are they called today? Tabloids, right? So we look at these tabloids and they're everywhere. You go to the grocery store and they're all over the place. And it's like cocaine, cheating, and lies, and like Blake dumps Gwen and all this stuff, which is funny because they're still married, okay? So all these different things, right, are happening. Do you guys see how they have like these big words and like shocking, she never loved me for who I am, right? It's all these exaggerated headlines. And why do they do exaggerated headlines? So you can buy it, right? Nobody wants to see Gwen and Blake are madly in love. They had a small fight, but it's all better now, right? Nobody cares about those. We want the good stuff. We want the trash stuff, right? We want the stuff that we can read. And it's kind of like, for example, when you go to like the airport. That's why the airport always has these, right? Because people want like those juicy secrets. Like, do we really care about, like, for example, how much money Kylie Jenner spent on her baby's first birthday? No, and yet there's entire news articles all about it and all over the place, right? They want to sell papers. So the problem is 1800s, kind of slow, right? We wanted to be able to get some stuff, but hey, there's some stuff happening in Cuba, and that's kind of interesting. So they start publishing these exaggerated news stories just like this, all about the stuff that's happening in Spain and in Cuba. And so what ends up happening is they start to do this thing called yellow journalism, and if you will star yellow journalism, it is actually its own key concept. Yellow journalism is when they do these exaggerated headlines that attract the viewer. So, survives mad leap, woman jumps from the Brooklyn Bridge, and you would sit there and go, extra, extra, woman jumps from the bridge, almost dies, whatever it could be, to get people to buy your headline and to buy your story. In terms of today, do people still use exaggerated headlines to convince you to click on things? Yeah, it's called clickbait, right? Those things that'll say something like, I'll see them all the time, it's like, woman earns $100,000 in 5 minutes, click here to see why. Or, for example, you'll see like, I'll see like some exaggerated headline that'll be like, shark attacks, ball of water and spears is everywhere, whatever it could be, because people want the headlines to click. Yeah?
There was one that showed a picture of an angry turtle that turtle sets house on fire.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and sometimes they'll do that. So, like, I've seen ones before. Like, there was an unfortunate incident like a year ago where an elderly lady died, and she had snakes. And nobody went and, like, noticed she was dead. And so, over time, the snake gets hungry, the snake ate her, okay? And so when they showed up at the house, this woman was being digested. The only thing about pythons, it's like a 30, 40-day process to eat something that large. So they found her. Well, what does the headline say? Savage snake eats poor elderly woman. right? And that's what they do to be able to get that. Ever heard of something called fake news? Yeah, similar things, right? They want that clickbait to be able to get in. They'll take one little thing that you did and they'll overly exaggerate it, right? To be able to make it a big story. All of that is this idea of this yellow journalism, exaggerated headlines to convince you to click it. And by the way, if you want to learn a life lesson, please, if you are interested in sharing things, retweeting things, Snapchatting things, restoring things on Instagram, whatever you do, please click on the link before you share it. Because one of my favorite things to do on Facebook is to be really annoyed at people when they share stuff. Because especially, I'll see these ones that say it takes 5 seconds to share and it's some missing kid. And then I click on the link and it's like found 2 months ago on the same day that the article was published. Okay? Please, if it says it takes 5 seconds to share, or like my favorites are the ones like, this poor baby will die if you don't reshare it. And it has like 50,000 shares on Facebook because people are like, that poor angel, I have to reshare it or else they'll die. No, they won't. It's usually a photo taken from the internet.
Or it's like you don't send this to 10 people.
Yeah, I get those all the times. Or it's like, well, I see ones too that it says like, if you scroll past this, your baby will die of cancer or something like that. And I'm like, oh, well, better get it.
Mr. Beast never clicked Facebook.
Yeah, and it was way worse back when it was only email, because then you would get the thread chains where you would get an email that says, if you don't share this to 20 emails, you die in 7 days. Something like that, right? Yeah, and I see a lot of elderly people will do that, and they'll reshare it. I've noticed it's a lot of ones that it says, like, if you scroll past this, you'll get, like, cancer, or you'll fall down a ravine or something like that, and all these people are like, oh my gosh, can't do that. So, anyways, so you have these exaggerated headlines. So what does this have anything to do with Spain? Well, what happens is that people start to publish these exaggerated things of what's happening. Now, a lot of it is real, but a lot of this is this way of trying to convince you. So you can see the poor Cuban is being roasted with the anarchy. You can see us, America, oh my gosh, we have to pour help with Lady Liberty, that poor Cuban who is under this. We'll talk about why Uncle Sam is blindfolded, because we didn't do anything yet about the problem. But people are starting to move towards war to help other people. Now again, is Spain directly attacking America? No, not yet. They're not directly attacking America. And so a lot of people, this is really our first start to feel like that social Darwinism. Those poor Cubans, we must help them. They can't help themselves. And that's what it starts to move into. Which brings us to this ship. What is this ship? USS Maine. Okay, good. Some people did their homework. So this is the USS Maine, which is a naval ship. Basically what happens is Havana starts to have many riots. America sends a ship that sits outside. Well, unfortunately, one night, the ship explodes. You see, the Cubans had placed bombs onto the ship, exploded the ship, and killed over 175 people. This is now Pearl Harbor, right? This is now the reason why we must go to war. The next day, the U.S. government asks for a declaration of war, and we officially go to war with Spain in what's called the Spanish-American War. What's the problem in this story? Spain didn't do it. Okay? What happened is if you look at this image, so in the ships, at the bottom of the ships, they have what's called a magazine. And the magazine, this was a new thing in this time period, would hold all the bullets. And so what's assumed is that as the bullets were going up into the turrets, it basically overheated, made all the bullets start to explode, and eventually exploded the entire magazine. It actually happens more commonly than you would think. Back in 2000, there was a terrorist attack, and that's what they did. They specifically struck the magazine because they knew it would explode the most. And so what happens is, America, even though the next day it was published in newspapers that the U.S. general did not believe Spain did it, what does all the Americans say? Who cares? It exploded. We're going to war. Okay? So all this yellow journalism really encourages this. Destruction of the warship Maine. It was not an accident, which is actually totally false. There's a conviction of all these criminals, all these different things of happening with this. Crisis is at hand, Spanish treachery, all these different things to convince Americans to go to war. And they did. They fully supported the war with the Spanish-American. But what is this? Really, it's yellow journalism. So what you're seeing, this is a really great cartoon for yellow journalism. You can see that it has the yellow press, and the devil is giving it to all the people, because that's what they want. They want the juicy, gory stories of these poor men that are going there. And so because of that, things shift, and now all of a sudden we're going to go to war with Spain over an event that really wasn't Spain's fault. But it doesn't matter, because you know what? We're going to do what we're going to do. Okay, so we're going to start to go to war with Spain in one of our shortest wars in American history. It's about a year and a half. But we actually don't start in the Caribbean. You see, George Dewey becomes the commander of the U.S. Navy, and they're going to attack. I don't think this was in yours, but does anybody know where they attacked first? They attacked the Philippines. You might say, wait a second, that has nothing to do with Cuba. That's because the Philippines were a Spanish colony, and so we began to attack there. We began to heavily attack it so much that it falls very quickly, and we then take and acquire the Philippines. We basically paid the government $20 million and made them an American colony. Now, this is a really famous photo that you'll notice. You can see it says America spans from wing to wing. We'll explain this more when we get to when we acquired all of our territories. But people also started to be against this. Is this wrong? Are we not just taking other colonies? Why are we even colonizing? That's not the American way of doing things. And so people started to be a little bit more concerned about what was going on. Then you switch to the war in the Caribbean, but there was a problem. We were not prepared for a war in the Caribbean. Who's ever been to the Caribbean? Okay, a couple people. What's the weather like? It's hot, and what else? Humid. It's humid too. So why don't we send all of our soldiers with wool uniforms, only one gun for every 3 person, and all the generals are like 60-year-old war vets from the Civil War. So we were really prepared. But you know who was prepared? Teddy Roosevelt. Because Teddy Roosevelt, our big bad boy, he is going to basically be this really awesome guy. Remember we talked about like the outdoors and stuff like that he loved? So he was part of a thing called the Rough Riders. So the Rough Riders were a whole bunch of cowboys that he recruited to go and fight in the Spanish-American War. He takes these Rough Riders and he shows up to go and help. And they have this boat. Well, the Rough Riders are cowboys, so they got all these horses, right? And so what they did, because the problem is, if you know anything about the Caribbean, there's all these reefs. They can't just go to shore. So what they would do is they would take their horses, and they would lower them down in like this little pulley thing, okay? They would then let the horse go. The horse swims to shore, 50, 75 yards away. Everybody's happy. All the horses successfully get off the boat, and then it's Teddy Roosevelt's turn. Now, if you're a general, you typically have 4 horses for you, because if one dies, they have another one ready to go. So they take his first horse, they put it down into the water, it turns around, and it swims out to the ocean. Take his second horse, put it into the water, turns around, swims out to the ocean. Third horse, swims out to the ocean. Finally, on the 4th horse, because there was no other horses available, they finally put somebody on the horse. The horse turned around to the ocean, swam around the back of the ship, and they eventually were able to turn it around to get it back into the ocean and have Teddy Roosevelt ride it. Well, what else are you going to do to get the horses there? Put them in a boat? If you try to put a horse in a boat, it doesn't work. So what happens is Teddy Roosevelt then becomes the most famous person because of a single battle known as the Battle of San Juan Hill. As you can guess, it was on a hill. They were at the bottom of the hill. They were matched by about 4 times more men at the top of the hill than they themselves. Teddy Roosevelt very famously did not wait at the back. He basically went to the front and he said, let's go. And then he went all the way up the hill, defeated the Spanish. It becomes a massive success, so much so that Teddy Roosevelt becomes immortalized in history. They made all these cartoons. The actual comic strips actually ended in like 1960. Everybody loved this idea of the cowboy going and winning it. And then in the end, America wins that battle, one more battle at Manila Bay, and the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. And then they're going to win it. Okay? So this is what we got from this treaty. And this is what you really need to know about the impact. So you need to know the causes of the war. You need to know why we fought it. You don't need to know as much about the battles, but you know Teddy Roosevelt's cool. But what you really need to know is what happened at the end. So at the end, what you need to put down is the massive effect is we now gain territories. In fact, if you look at a map, we gained about 15 territories that most of them we still have today. So for example, you can see we have Puerto Rico still. You have Hawaii, we won't talk about right now, but we have like Johnstown, Midway, you have Wake, you have Guam, American Samoa, the Mariana Islands are all in here. At the time we have the Philippines, but we won't have that in about 30 years. All of these are various territories that we have gained. So if you've ever been to an American territory before, it more than likely came from the Spanish-American War. We gained all these Spanish territories because of that. And what happens is now America gets all these things. Now, in Puerto Rico, you need to know for Puerto Rico a thing called the Forsaker Act. The four Sacred Acts set up in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico was set up as a colony. And basically they set up their own government, but said that they are controlled by America. Now, Puerto Rico today is probably the most famous out of all the colonies. You do not have to have a passport to go to it. You can just hop on a plane, even though it's another country, just like with any American territory. However, the big debate with Puerto Rico is, should it become a state? So how it works is about every 4 years, Puerto Rico votes on statehood. They have for the last several years, every year they vote no. Last time, though, it was 60-40. So it was very close. A lot of the reason they don't vote for it, though, is a couple of reasons. First, as soon as you vote yes, you have to pay federal taxes. So it's part of the reason why. And you have to sign up for the military draft. But you could vote in presidential elections. So one of the big concerns was, especially after the last hurricane that happened, very little aid in terms of compared to what's been sent in the past to other areas was not sent. So while Hurricane Maria did have a lot of stuff go to Puerto Rico, it wasn't as much that was sent to like Houston, Texas during the same hurricane. And so there's a lot of concerns over that. They'll get more federal funding. It'll be more stabilized. But one of the biggest reasons they don't want to become a state is that Hispanic heritage. As soon as you become American, you're now an American. If you go ask a Puerto Rican, hey, what nation are you from? They'll say Puerto Rico. They won't say I'm from America. And part of the concern is, as soon as you switch to that, you've now lost your heritage and your culture. What I will say, though, is if they vote, that is an automatic vote in, which means you could, at some point, have 51 states in America. So it all just depends. The last time was the closest, but every couple of years they vote. As soon as they vote more than 50%, they are automatically a state in the United States. So it's every presidential election. So it'll be, I haven't heard as much right now. The biggest issue with Puerto Rico right now, though, Puerto Rico is still in shambles. Even though it's been 2 years since Hurricane Maria, about 40% of their state or nation is still doesn't have power. I know of AP US history teachers there. They still can't teach because they don't have schools. So it's still in a huge disarray. And if you know, there's also a lot of controversy still with Puerto Rico. I believe it was 1 month ago. They discovered a warehouse that had unused diapers, formula, water, and emergency supplies that could have helped thousands of people have been sat abandoned for the last 2 years. So there's a lot of controversy with Puerto Rico, but it is a colony. So while we help them, they do not receive the same rights or aids as an American state. And part of the administration said, look, they are choosing not to pay federal taxes. Our federal taxes are paying that. So if you want to be able to receive that help, you will need to become a state. So we'll see. But the biggest thing is cultural. It's emotional. I don't want to be an American. I want to be Puerto Rican. Okay? And the other one you need to know, too, is the Platt Amendment. So this is what we did in Cuba. So with the Platt Amendment, we originally basically let them set up their own government. We eventually gave back Cuba their independence a few months later. But what you need to know is we basically became a protectorate. So you can have your own country, but we can help control what's in your country. We later give Cuba back, and we have very, very strained relationships with Cuba. But that's mostly Cold War stuff, which we'll talk about later. It becomes communist. All right, now from there, other terms that you need to know, Anti-Imperialist League, again, just know that anything that's really against it is the Anti-Imperialist League. That's pretty obvious. Hawaii, I want to just point out Hawaii because I think there's something really interesting about it. Part of the reason that people wanted to acquire Hawaii in terms of social Darwinism again had to do with these savages allegedly in Hawaii. So Hawaii, actually, their original law system is something called the Kapu system. So if you actually watch like Lilo and Stitch, it has this word Kapu in it. That's because that's the Hawaiian word for like stop, halt, don't go, don't enter. That was the original system. But the law system of Kapu is extremely violent. So, for example, if you are a female in the Kapu system, you are not allowed to eat bananas or pigs. If you do that, that is actually an executable offense. But they're not just going to kill you. They're going to really kill you through execution. For example, this is one form of punishment that is an execution. It's basically where they tie in the noose around your neck until you're barely able to breathe, and then they leave you for 3 days. So it's basically a torture technique. But if you say, oh, well, I should just die. Well, how they're going to kill you is they're going to basically hit you to death with a club. So it's an extremely violent. So when Captain Cook in the 1700s came along Hawaii and discovered it, right? He came along this and basically said these people are too savage and we're going to Christianize them. So he sent all these Christian missionaries to better the Hawaiian Islands, which is part of the reason why there is also, so it was the first major mission for the LDS missions outside of the United States and England. And it was also, is currently right now, I think it's the 4th biggest state in terms of population of LDS people in Hawaii, compared to the greater population in terms of amount of people, because it's a massive amount. That's why they're building so many temples there, because it became so Christianized over in Hawaii. But it was one of the major missions after England was formed. So why do we care about this? Again, it comes back to trade. We love sugar. American planters begin to have sugar, pineapples, different things like that in Hawaii. The problem is, this queen comes into power and wants to establish an independent rule. It had been too much controlled by the American planters. So America responds by putting it under military rule. The President of the United States sends military officers to surround the palace and puts her under basically house arrest until she agrees to comply. Sanford Dole, which you guys read about, he basically is the major planter of this. If you've ever had a Dole Whip, you can thank the guy that helped the takeover of Hawaii for that Dole Whip, because his last name was Dole. And basically what happened is he absolutely puts the money in, overtakes the government, which ends up having the American way, becomes the first governor, and it is what is called annexed. Now, if you will put next to Hawaii the word annexed. Do you guys remember we talked about annexation before? Does anybody remember what it means when we annex something?
We say take land without yours, that's not yours, without us.
Yeah, exactly. So basically we say, you are now American. And if you disagree, well, we're going to come and fight you for it. So we annex Hawaii, and now Hawaii becomes eventually a state, but not at this time, mostly due to racism. And if you want to celebrate the acquisition of Hawaii, you can go spend your $500 bill, because it has McKinley on the $500 bill. Yeah. So we do have $500 bills in circulation. However, they're no longer printed, which is why the $500 bill is actually worth about 50 grand. So if it were me and you got a $500 bill, I wouldn't spend it. I would sell it if it were me. But you can celebrate McKinley's acquisition of Hawaii by going and having that. Or having a Dole Whip and sit there and think about the Hawaiians who were overtaken by the Americans. And that'll help you. Okay? China open door policy. I would highlight John Hay. He's a really good sourcing. I'm not going to focus on this a ton. You should already know what it means. Basically, America agrees with other European nations not to fight over the Chinese trade grounds. Big stick diplomacy is the one I would star. This is the one I've talked about previously. And if you want to highlight that, speak softly and carry a big stick. This is what America says. Basically, you listen to us or we're going to fight you. So we speak softly and kindly, but we're always ready to do what is necessary, which is why you see that big stick in the Caribbean Sea. That's all about Cuba. And then you also have that new diplomacy. It's all about that big stick diplomacy of going to other nations. This also has another term about it. What's the term that you learned in your homework? It's actually one of your analysis. America should become the world's policeman. Okay, and do we still believe that now, that it's America's responsibility to kind of police the world? A little bit. Okay, so if you think about, for example, you look at other countries like Iraq. We go into Iraq to be able to establish a democratic government. We look into possibly going into, like, for example, should we go to North Korea to be able to police them for what they're doing? This is a term that we've always done. So make sure you put next to big stick diplomacy, world's policeman. Roosevelt Corollary is a common one. It's basically where we violate the Monroe Doctrine, but we didn't violate the Monroe Doctrine because that was only for Europe. So basically, remember Monroe Doctrine, which I would highlight the contextualization because that's the more common one that you'll see. The Monroe Doctrine says that Europe can no longer be involved in American affairs, but can America? Yep. And the Roosevelt Corollary says that. So America says it's our responsibility to now protect the Americas from Europe, so we are going to send our military to stop them from going in. Unfortunately, this also allows America to come in. So, for example, the Panama Canal, if you want to do an arrow between Roosevelt Corollary, that's probably the best example. As you guys learned about, we wanted more trade routes, which is the major context for this. So we create the Panama Canal through, oh yeah, I'm up to date, we're good. Through Panama. But if you know anything about Panama, Panama goes up about 5 miles above sea level. So how are you going to get ships to go across when the sea level is so high? So that's when you get your lock systems. So basically, the Panama Canal is a massive series of locks, And so when you go through these massive locks, it allows you to go up, and then it allows you to drop down. Has anybody been on a cruise, by the way, to the Panama Canal? So you can go on a cruise. It's actually like what I'm going to do when I retire. I already have it all planned. I'm going to go on a Panama cruise, on the Disney cruise. It's going to be great because you have to get through that passage, and it takes a full 24 hours to get through the locks. So even though it's only like 20 miles, it takes 24 hours to get through because it takes so long to go through it. So that's why it's actually considered a stop, because literally the entire day is you watching yourself go through the lock systems to be able to get back and forth through the Panama Canal. And it massively increases trade, which is what most of our trade goes through right now. Well, yeah, it's much, much faster than going through the south, yeah. Gentleman's agreement, basically, I would just know Japan for this. You already should know what it is. Pretty much discrimination happens in California. We also didn't want the immigrants, so we agree with the gentleman's agreement. Japan bans immigrants, and we will stop segregation as well. And then Taft, I basically would put next to Taft, he wasn't very successful with his imperialism. Taft basically said that we're going to send money and businesses to other countries and become imperialistic. But as you know from your reading, it didn't really work out too well, especially because every money we sent, it didn't really stop the insurgencies. So from there, that's imperialism and the 10 into World War I.